You're live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Jozi.js September. Stay safe. Tonight, we've got some amazing speakers. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some house rules. Well, before we get there, we know that it's spring now, and if you're like me, you're probably struggling to breathe. Just stay safe, stay at home. There's a less chance of you catching any of the bad stuff that's all out there. With that said, we miss seeing all of your amazing faces. Just a quick announcement, Jozi.js has officially over 2,000 members now on meetup.com. So we're really super excited to see all of you soon. We will be going back to our venue once it is safe to do so, and in due course. At this point, we don't know exactly when that will be, but we'll be sure to keep all of you up to date once we know ourselves. So our code of conduct is pretty simple, can be summarized into 4 very simple points. Firstly, be nice. Just generally be nice. Be nice to the people around you, be nice to people in the chat and comment sections, be respectful and constructive. We're all learning, and learning is an amazing journey. Be there for people around you and help them grow. That said, it's important for everyone here to work together. As we do in putting this together, we would also expect the same from everyone who participates with us. We encourage communication. We encourage people to get in touch with us and with each other. But that said, do not be spammy. Don't be spammy, and let's respect each other. So generally, I think the first point covers our entire code of conduct succinctly. So Jozi.js is put together and organized by a council of wizards. We even have the hats to prove we're wizards. And these are incredible people that are always willing to connect with all of you. Their Twitter handles are there on your screen. And this video, since it's streaming on YouTube, will be made available immediately after this live broadcast. So you're more than welcome to come back and take a look at these people's handles. Connect with us on Twitter, ask us your questions, and we will try our level best to help you in any way that we can. Big shout out and big thanks to our 3 sponsors, BBD for sponsoring venue and food when we do use the venue, and hopefully that'll be soon again once this pandemic is under control. Inesis for being our tech sponsor, guess we can consider them that, and sponsoring our other meetup, Soweto.js. And would also like to say thank you, of course, to Microsoft for being our meetup sponsor. So Jozi.js is about community. It's about you speaking to other web developers around you. We would like to hear from you. We're very beginner friendly. So even if you've never spoken before, please submit a talk. In order to start being a speaker, you need to actually start. And I think this is probably one of the best places that you can start. We've got a community of people who are very beginner friendly and who will give you positive feedback and who will help you grow and improve where you might need to. We've also got an amazing council of wizards that are more than happy to help you prepare for your talk should you need to. So please submit a talk. And just in case you miss one of these live broadcasts, you're more than welcome to go to our YouTube channel, Jozi.js, to watch our past talks. Because I know that I've just said a lot. You've got QR codes on your screen that you can, of course, pause and rewind so that you can get the direct link to those 2 things. Very important things. Now, for the remainder of this session, you can comment and ask questions on Slido. Use this QR code to get access to Slido via the direct link, and our event ID is 18273 as it is shown on your screen. Please connect with us. Once you've asked your questions at the end of these sessions, I will ask our amazing speakers your questions so that they can actually help us and answer your questions. So with that said, our first speaker is actually going to be almost, I won't say partially, but it's fully recorded, but in a way that's quite interesting. So our first speaker is Fadzayi, who will be talking about privacy by design rather. So the art of war, privacy by design by Fadzayi.
Okay, so I'm going to share our eventually consistent speaker. So Fadzayi sent a presentation with some audio. Wait, let me just start that again. Sorry, I think I did the wrong thing immediately. Share computer sound, absolutely. And people must just say if they can't hear the audio coming through.
Welcome to Live Television.
So, yeah, so take it away, Fadzayi.
Hi guys, my name is Fadzayi and I'm a web developer at 1.4 Consulting. And I'm also studying cybersecurity at Edith Cowan University all the way in Perth, Australia, which is one of the reasons why we've had to pre-record this session, because I think I'm like 6 hours ahead of you guys. So by the time you watch this, it's probably like 1 a.m. right now, my end. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about privacy by design. And I'm not an expert in this area, but it's something that just sparked my interest through the studies that I'm doing right now, and just realizing how vulnerable our information, I mean, not just our information, but how vulnerable we are as people at the moment with this information that we're giving out to all sorts of organizations online without realizing, without knowing what they're doing with this information. So, but it also made me realize, like, as professionals, I think we've all experienced clients who trust us way too much with information. Personally, I can say that I've had clients who've given me access to their email addresses voluntarily. They just say, "Oh, my email, just get into my email and get what you need," and they give me their username and password. And then in the same breath, they say, "Oh, by the way, that's the same email line, that's the same password that I use for everything else." And I'm thinking, oh wow, so including your bank accounts. And thank goodness I've been raised right. I can just imagine a cyber criminal getting a hold of those details and being, given access to all these platforms. Think you have a field day. So given that our clients out there trust us so much, it just makes us realize that we've got an ethical and a moral obligation to protect our users from cyber attacks, just to protect their dignity and to protect their information that they put out there via the software that we build. And so the privacy by design framework is one way we can protect our users, because we need to anticipate, we need to manage and prevent privacy issues before the code is written. We need to do it from the design stage. So product designers, software developers need to be in this together, because it needs to be done from the very beginning of a project. I think one of my favorite books that I've read is The Art of War by Sun-Tzu. So Sun-Tzu was I think he was a Chinese general, and he wrote a book, and he's got one of these famous quotes where he just says, "If you know the enemy and if you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." And this concept has been used in cybersecurity a lot, because what it means is you need to know the software, the systems, the products that you're building. You need to know them inside out and the vulnerabilities that are within those systems. And you also need to know the kind of threats that are out there that could come and take advantage of the vulnerabilities within your system. And if you know both your system and the threats that are out there, you know how to protect yourself so you can win the victory against cybercrime. And so I think we need to just adapt some art of war when we're dealing with data protection within the industry and within the software that we're building. So what is privacy by design? Privacy by design is an approach to project planning that integrates principles of privacy protection at the very beginning of and throughout any organizational activity, including the software that you're building, any product that you're building. You embed the privacy measures from the beginning, as I said before. It ensures that good privacy practices are built into an organization's decision making. So every single decision that is being made by that organization is putting into consideration what threats might be of concern to the software you're building, to the product you're building, or whatever it is that you're building as an organization. So the idea pretty much is to bake the security into the code of any product from the early stages. And we need to understand that PBD comes before the fact. So it doesn't offer any remedy, to an incident. It comes before the fact and not after the fact. And it aims to prevent any infractions, any privacy infractions from happening, from occurring. Because the best way to mitigate privacy risks is not to create them in the first place. So the framework has been around for quite a while. It's been there since the early 90s, and it was devised by Dr. Anne Cavoukian. She's the former Privacy Commissioner of Ontario in Canada. And her aim was to address the common issue of developers applying privacy fixes after the project is completed. Because if you really think about it, developers do what they're told to do, right? They are following instructions. They don't have a problem with embedding privacy measures into any product, as long as it's there in the spec doc, as long as it's there on their task cards, they will do it. The problem that she found was that it comes from the top. For as long as the powers that be do not make it a priority and they don't make it a mandatory requirement from the get-go, it's just not going to happen. So her idea for coming up with this framework was to have those that are giving instructions from the top to make it a mandatory requirement from the beginning of any product design, from any product project. And she came up with she came up with the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design, which help as guidelines for teams to follow and, try and apply the concept of privacy by design as much as they can. So privacy by design is proactive and not reactive, meaning that it anticipates and prevents privacy breaches before they happen. And this is achieved by having methods in place that help recognize poor privacy designs, the possible outcome, and correcting any negative impacts before they occur in a systematic and innovative way. It should also be a default setting. So that means that your users' data should automatically be protected in any given system. They shouldn't need to take any additional actions to secure their own privacy, because whatever data you're collecting, it's your responsibility. So just a few standards that, like bare minimum standards that we can follow is, for instance, informing the users that their data will be collected, how it will be collected, how it's going to be stored, and who will have access to this data, especially if you're going to be granting access to third-party organizations, because the users could be okay with you accessing their data, but are they really okay with the other organization that you're in partnership with accessing that same data? So that cannot be just assumed. You need to get that consent as well. The collection of that data needs to be lawful, to be collected lawfully. It needs to be collected fairly, and it needs to be limited to data that is necessary for that specified purpose. For example, my Fitbit does not need my identity number, so they have no business collecting that data. We also need to embed privacy into the design, so it needs to be seen as a core function of any given system. It shouldn't come as an afterthought and say, oh, the product is done, but we need to add this one privacy measure to it. That should have been thought of from the get-go. As mentioned before, it comes before the fact, right? It needs to be done right at the beginning. It should also be seen as a positive sum and not a zero-sum game between security and privacy. It's desirable to have a secure system, but one that also protects its consumers, its users' data. We always need to incorporate end-to-end security in the products that we develop, because robust security measures are vital to privacy from beginning to the end. Ensuring all data is securely retained and securely destroyed at the end of the process when we no longer need the data, and providing what is known as a cradle-to-grave secure life cycle management. There's also this great need as well in privacy by design to be visible and transparent in our processes. And this is essential to establishing accountability and trust between the organization and the stakeholders and the users as well. And the process should be open, it should be well documented, independently verifiable, and should be able to go under scrutiny at any given. And lastly, privacy by design is user-centric. Respect for users' privacy, because the best approach is one that consciously puts the interests and the needs of the individual users first. It's really important that we empower users by allowing them to play an active role in the management of their own data. And this means that the user needs to always have access to their data and give consent wherever their data is concerned. And the greater the sensitivity of that data, the clearer and more specific the quality of that consent should be. And also keeping in mind as operators that consent can be withdrawn at any point, even at a later stage. We also need to make sure that the data that we're collecting is accurate and it's complete. And the only way we can do that is allowing the user to always have access to this data and being in a position and giving them that power to be in a position to confirm the accuracy of that data, even if it means they have to notify the administrator where they cannot edit the data themselves, but they need to have access to that data and have a channel to be able to correct the data that we are storing. And respect for user privacy extends to the need for interfaces to also be human-centered and user-friendly, so that users can make informed and privacy decisions. And we see this with like accept terms and conditions, with tick to give your consent for us to share your data. Those interfaces that we're building need to communicate this quite thoroughly and clearly to the users.
Uh-oh, what did I do?
So how do we apply privacy by design? I'm not going to get into anything technical because I've got a full resource that I will be sharing at the end of the talk that will help developers with processes that they can follow on how to do so. But just mentioning a few things, like avoiding unnecessary app permissions that suggest privacy invasion, such as access to contacts, access to camera and microphone, minimizing the data that we collect, so which is called data minimization. As mentioned before, we just need to collect data that is necessary to the specific purpose we need it for. Pseudonymize personal data, so getting rid of identifiable information, deleting data regularly, especially redundant data. We need to have clear privacy and data sharing notices, and making sure that these notices are up to date, especially if there's a change in law, if there's a change in policy. Include opt-ins for apps and websites that do have some kind of subscription. Avoid social media registration where you can, especially if you're actually collecting very sensitive data for very sensitive purposes like banking. I know it might sound silly, but I have experienced clients who have suggested including a Facebook sign-in option on a banking app. You wouldn't want that. Disabling default social media sharing. Separate consent for data sharing. So what I mean by that is, I think, as I mentioned in one of the 7 foundational principles, just because the user is okay with you having access to their data does not mean they are okay with having the third-party organization you're partnered with accessing that same data. So that consent should be separated for giving the third party access to their data. They need to know about that. We also need to remind users to review policies, especially if there has been a change, and just deleting redundant data as mentioned before. So in addition to that, there's also stuff like password hashing and salting, and this is at a database level. Data sandboxing, which is pretty much just having a separate environment on a network that mimics end user operating environments. And this just allows you as an operator to safely execute suspicious code without risking harm to the host device or network. Pseudonymization and anonymization of data, which is, as mentioned before, removes any identifiable data. So it just removes information in a data set that identifies a specific individual. And this really helps with curbing certain practices like profiling, encryption of data at rest and data in transit. Data at rest is just information that is inactive and is stored physically in any digital form. And data in transit is data that is sent over a network. So for instance, when you are performing a transaction within your banking app, that is very much data in transit, or like instant messaging like WhatsApp, that is data in transit. So that encryption is quite vital, which is also why we use the HTTPS and all that. It's just all that is there to help encrypt data in transit. Responsible disclosure to our customers, training and accountability for staff on data protection, and physical security of servers and systems and storage. So with
play. No, sorry, folks.
So with that, and in conclusion, I have attached here, I've included rather, some resources that I have found really helpful. The Web Application Security by Andrew Hoffman. This is a free download actually on the NGNIX website. And this is really good because it also gives you some code snippets that you can use for your web applications and all that. And also the South Africa's POPI Act and the 7 foundational principles. I'll be sharing this on my Twitter handle. Right. I'm going to upload it to Speaker Deck and share the link to the slides on Twitter. Yeah, so yes, thank you so much. I'm Fadzayi and I'm a developer, and my Twitter handle is @FadzayiC, and you can follow me and just ask questions. Like I said, I'm really not an expert in the field. I'm still studying, but I do read a lot about it. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So thanks to Fadzayi. The host has stopped my video. Start my video. Yeah. So thank you very much to Fadzayi. Do we have any questions, Lucky?
Not at this. So we will take all of the questions at once at the end, since Fadzayi isn't here to answer any questions. And since you, Mike, are the one who shared Fadzayi's slides, I will put the responsibility of answering any potential questions on your shoulders.
Hi.
But that's it, with putting things on your shoulders. I think Fadzayi's talk was very, very important, given all of the chat that's happening on social media around the South African COVID app and security and privacy. And I think the big thing that Fadzayi said was that all of this is about being user-centric, and our users, or the people that we build software for, are also becoming very aware of privacy issues. So if your application is going to ask for my ID number and my blood type and my location and my DNA, it's going to raise some suspicions if all I'm doing is trying to take a picture of myself. So you also want to retain your users there. Up next, we have the incredible Mike Geyser, who often says to me when I speak about writing a blog, and I keep telling him about all these amazing platforms that I found, he always has one response to me: you're a web developer, why don't you build your own? With that said, Mike will be telling us how to build better websites with Eleventy. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me get started here. Start my slides. And yes, I'm going to hopefully show you how to build better websites using something that I find personally delightful, which is Eleventy. Now, before we get there, who on earth am I? Well, you probably know that I'm an organizer of Jozi.js. Yeah.
Sorry, Mike. You're not sharing your screen with us.
Am I not? Did I stop sharing? Oh, my word.
There we go.
Okay, wait, I'm sharing. Sharing.
There we go.
Thank you very much, Lucky. Okay. Unfortunately, I lose everybody when I start. Okay, cool. Can we see that?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, great. Let's start again. That's not embarrassing at all. I'm a serious professional, I promise. So yes, as you realize, I help organize this show. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, and my specialization area for that is in performance and capabilities. So making the web faster and giving new features, particularly like offline support and so on and so forth. I work at a company called TES, whose mission is to empower teachers globally so that every child has a good education. And it's a nice site to work on with a nice product. But my primary responsibility there is making sure that late on a Sunday night, when teachers don't have anything to teach the next morning, they can go and find some stuff to give children class tests or something. So that's me. So this thing that I've been talking about that I enjoy working with so much, Eleventy, what is it? Well, it's a very, very simple static site generator, which is, I think, relatively unopinionated. It has some opinions baked into it by default, but you can override most of them. So I think it hits a very nice sweet spot in terms of tool where it doesn't try and enforce its will upon you too much. And the creator of Eleventy sees it much more as not a framework, so not all in, but far more as a utility to string together the bits and pieces that your website is made of. And I think you can think of it like the idea of some sort of templating of your website with access to a bunch of data and then generating something that is relatively static. Now, I appreciate that I filled the title with a very loaded term, which is better. And what is better? What makes a better website? And this is completely subjective. This is my perspective, and yours will be very different. And just keep that in mind. But from my perspective, a website is better when it is simpler, so structurally simpler, in terms of the software that you run, in terms of how it's wired up and how it's put together, that it's easier. So it's easy to build something, which reduces the friction to writing good code, and that it's faster. And this is also an ambiguous phrase, like, is it faster to write or is it faster to run? And in the context of Eleventy, I really think both. It's very quick to give you a solution that is very fast for your users. And like, their logo is a possum being lifted by a balloon. How is that not better? Anyway, there are a bunch of people who trust it. There are a whole bunch of fancy people whose pictures and profiles you may notice in the bottom there if you go and look really, really hard while pausing this on video. And there's a whole bunch of really big companies that trust Eleventy for their domains and their properties. The CERN, Chrome has several properties, CSS Tricks, FF Khan Academy, Netlify. There are a lot of people who build really, really big, really important websites that believe that this is the way that one should build big and important websites. So we're going to take a little bit of a step back for the moment, and we're going to look at, well, in terms of rendering, oh, I see there's a little bit of a slide bug there, sorry. But in terms of rendering, what options are available to you? Okay, so when we're talking about rendering HTML to a screen. Now, on the one side, we have what we typically end up talking about here at Jozi.js, which is client-side rendering, where all of the processing happens on the client, and we ship all of the JavaScript that executes all of the data down to the client machine, which is the browser, and then do stuff there. And it gives us the most dynamic experience. So that's pretty awesome, but with a cost, in the fact that it is the slowest in terms of CPU, because all of the logic is run on a machine that is uncontrolled and unpredictable on the other side of a network connection. Now, we often see the performant way of not dealing with that problem as being server-side rendering, where all of the work is still on CPU. So we're still runtime generating a whole bunch of HTML on every single request, and we're sending that data down the pipe to the user. And this gives us the greatest balance from a performance perspective. It gives us pretty good rendering performance. It gives us pretty good dynamism in terms of being able to tailor the HTML we send back on a request by request basis, but it's not as dynamic as client side. And then on the other side, when we talk about static, and static has a really bad name in terms of being an unchanging website. So it's very clearly the least dynamic because we have to change code for things to change. The difference being twofold. First, that it's stored on disk, and second, that it's really, really fast, because we're taking the CPU out of it entirely. Now, anybody that's looked at any kind of performance or scalability stuff would know that from a cost perspective, so rands and cents, CPU is far more expensive on disk, or far more expensive than disk. So if we can get away with putting things and serving things off of disk rather than having to dedicate really expensive CPU time to it, it gives us a really cheap solution. Moving on from that, when we look at how things are built, well, for client-side code, we end up with a really complex architecture, relatively speaking. And the reason why it's complex is because we have to deal with things like consistency. When we change data, how do we know that when we go to the next page, that data is changed? Security, right? Because we're running all of the code on the client side on somebody untrusted's machine. We have to treat that machine as untrusted. And like, how do we keep the data safe and keep the clients safe when we don't really have very much control? And then managing state in an environment where they can just close the tab, and then what happens on the next tab when they reopen or visit the site. Now, in contrast to that, the server side simplifies some of those assumptions at the cost of being operationally far more complex. We now have to worry about deployment and like, how many machines do we deploy to? And how do we go about getting running code and runtimes and executables operating on a server? How do we watch that server and make sure that the servers that we're paying for are actually still running? And how do we scale on demand? So how do we make sure that we've got enough of those servers and, you know, make sure that we've got enough CPU time? And then finally, the static or pre-rendered stuff typically has very complicated tooling to deal with this stuff. How do you build a website and change a website dynamically so that you're just getting static files at the end of the day? How do you store that stuff so that you can then serve it later on? And that's basically what we're talking about when we talk about Eleventy. Because I firmly believe that if you reduce the impact of that tooling and build burden, we can make the most benefit of static and then really build compelling experiences that are both easy and cheap and fast. Now, what is it exactly that makes Eleventy Eleventy? Well, the first thing is that it's got a very, very much a folder convention-based approach. And that says that the output that it's going to spit out matches the source that you put in. And the net result, and I'll show that in a moment, is that your folder structure matches your URL structure. And this is how the web was designed to work, that the URL is representative of some relative directory structure. And this means that if you do it right, which Eleventy leads you into that default, you can get really clean looking URLs that look like a very fancy router without needing the complicated piece of equipment that is a router in your stack. And you can change bits and pieces around and still provide a customizable output based off of whatever input it is that you want. The next part that makes Eleventy is the multiple templating languages that get supported, because it supports 11 out of the box. Now, I'm pretty sure that the fact that it supports 11 templating languages and that it's called Eleventy, probably like it's the origin of the name or something along those lines, but it's just speculation. The default that it uses, if you don't specify anything, is liquid syntax, which is a very convenient markdown templating language, which is a very convenient way to write content that gets generated into HTML. And it makes very heavy use of something called front matter, which is basically YAML structure that sits at the top of a markdown file that gives it a whole bunch of metadata that's relevant to that file. And importantly, the templating languages are not tied into one or the other. You can mix and match as you see fit and use the right templating language for the right situation. So that's a very good thing. It's designed to work really well with data, and it has this concept of a data cascade, which is actually really simple and really natural if you think about it from a CSS perspective. So the data cascade says, well, there's a whole bunch of data that gets defined globally there's data that gets defined for this directory and all subdirectories, and there's front metadata that's dedicated to each individual page. And the directory data overwrites the global data, and the front metadata overwrites the directory data. And it gives you this very good specificity in terms of like which data you're dealing with at which point in time. And then finally, something that's really, really appealing to me is that it's not a JavaScript framework, right? It's just a utility that tries to do as little as possible and get out of your way. And the emitted output has no JavaScript in it. Now, I know that might not seem like a great thing in terms of wanting heavy lifting frameworks that do a lot for you and you get a lot for free, but there's also no surprises. So if you care about performance and you care about functionality, it's never going to trip you up by, oh, I actually emit this kind of JavaScript and it's actually going to take up 50 kilobytes of your delicate performance budget. So with that said and done, let's go to a demo quickly, and let me see if I can show rather than tell. So let's hide this. Let's hide Zoom. We don't need Zoom. Wait, I do need Zoom. I just don't need this window of Zoom. Cool, let's put that back. And let me get my code up. All right, so what I've got here is a very, very simple empty application. Okay. I've got a package.json with two things installed as dev dependencies. The one, which is the Eleventy CLI, which you're welcome to install globally on your machine, but I've just put it as a dev dependency so that it's scoped to this, and then node fetch, which I'm going to use later on. There's literally nothing else in this directory, okay? And how you would start building a website, well, actually, let's start with this. Let's run npx Eleventy, which is how you would run the Eleventy CLI. And it does some stuff and it writes 0 files, and that's because our directory is empty. So if we create a random file, let's just call it hello.md, and inside hello, we put a title, and that title is hello Jozi.js. This is some meaningful text content. Content. We save that and then we run Eleventy again, and then you will see on the left hand side it spat out an _site directory by default, and in that site directory we've got a folder called hello, and inside that folder called hello we've got an index.html. Okay, and that index.html has a little bit of HTML fragment that gets derived from the markdown, sorry. And if I then go npx Eleventy --serve, I will get a URL that I can go to, and if I drag it across here, I get nothing. But that's because we don't have anything at the root of the site, right? Where we have stuff is under the hello index.html directory. So if I were to go /hello, you would see the website, and we get a nice URL, we get some content, and it's pretty easy, right? Now, as Lucky said, like blogs are cool, right? All the cool kids are building blogs nowadays and want to build their own blog. So I think it's a very accessible example for us to start with to look at how to do stuff in Eleventy. So we're going to create a simple blog. So we're going to have a posts directory. And instead of our posts directory, we're going to go and create something that's creatively called post1.md. And we're going to go first one, and I'm going to just smash some content in here using Lorem Gibson, right? This is I don't know, some sort of dystopian fiction blog of some kind. Let's pretend it's that. And then I'm going to create another file that's going to be post2.md. And then we're going to go writing is hard. And then I'm going to smash some more content in there. Whatever. Okay, and you'll see that every single time I hit save, it keeps reloading and generating stuff, right? So I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit, because you can see it moving there. And in our sites directory, there's now a posts directory, and there is a post 1 and a post 2. And for post 1, we've got that markup, and for post 2, we've got that markup. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And if we were to go to our site, we can now go to posts/post-1, and we can see post 1, and we could go to post 2 and see post 2. So we've got a simple little site. We're going to need a little bit more stuff, right? So let's look at putting some data in here, because we're going to need it. So let's say that I need a little bit of metadata for every single site. So I'm going to put some front meta in place. See, Sheena, I'm writing Python. Front meta is Python, YAML's Python, right? You should be proud. So it's going to need a title. Let's just put a title in place in our front meta. And let's put a date. So like when this thing was published. And this is going to be 2020-01-01. Okay. Because we started off with New Year's resolution wanting to write our dystopian fiction blog. And then the second post we wrote is going to be, it's again copied, writing is hard. Title, writing is hard. And the date is going to be what, like July, because that's how blogs work, right? You write once and then 7 months later you write again, because writing is hard. So we're going to do that. And now importantly, it spat out some stuff, but that data doesn't exist here. Okay, it doesn't render markdown. It strips that out and it uses it from a metadata perspective. And how we can use this is we can say, well, we want to have a root that shows all of our blog posts. So I'm going to, in the root of the application, create, or the root of the site, create a new file, and that's going to be posts.njk, right? So this is going to use the Nunchucks templating language, which is the same thing that Mozilla Developer Network uses. And it's very similar to Liquid. So in here, we're going to need a UL, or let's create a title first. And that title's going to be posts. And then inside there, we're going to need a UL, which is going to have an li inside of it, which is going to have an anchor tag inside of that. Oopsie. UL li a enter. Cool. And then we're going to open our nunchucks for, and we're going to go for post in collections, which is a special variable that Eleventy provides, dot posts. Okay. And I've forgotten something. We're going to reverse it, but I'll show you in a moment what I've forgotten. And then we're going to end for. Now this should be very, very familiar to people. And I think this was actually based off of Ginger, right? Which is the Python templating language. So there you go, Sheena. There's some more Python for you. If anybody wants to know why I've got the emphasis on Python, it's because Sheena's got the keynote at PyCon. You should totally go. Okay, so we're going to go post.url. And now this URL is, because everything is a page in this collection, right? So URL is something that Eleventy is going to provide. It understands where this thing is going to live, okay? And in terms of the stuff that we provide, we know that post has some data, which is in the front meta. And of that data, we want the title, okay? And then we're also going to go post.date. Now, date is something that Eleventy understands, and we override it in context of the front meta. So it's not dedicated data for us. Okay. Now, if I reload this and I go to posts, nothing will appear. Okay. And nothing will appear because I haven't added anything to this posts collection. Because for me to do that, I would need to go and tag it. So I would have to say tags is posts and tags is posts. And we can have this be anything. That can be as many as we want, and it will add this item to every collection that it matches. So it's a really simple, scalable thing. And now we will see writing is hard. Did I save the other one? Don't think I did. No. Let me save it, reload, and there are our two posts. But now we've got something here where like the date looks awful, and that's definitely not what we want. So this is not magic. This stuff is just JavaScript. So in terms of the date, I can just go, well, I want to local date string, like that, right? Which is just a JavaScript function that exists in date. And it does exactly what we expect. You can do whatever date format you want, and you can write your own functions, and you can go wild. And you can even register some like this reverse that is a nunchuck specific one. Okay. But it still looks awful. And if we were to look at the output, this is not even that index.html. That's not valid HTML. We need a head section. We need body. We need tags around that stuff. The browser is just making it look like it's a proper HTML page. So for this, by default, Eleventy expects something called an includes directory. And inside that includes directory, we can create a layout.njk, right? And that layout.njk is just going to be like our HTML. The only difference being that inside here, we've got a special variable called content, which we're going to render. And we're going to say, well, this is safe. Don't HTML escape that content. And if you've worked with server-side templating languages, this is relatively familiar. Okay. And we can access the title, which we put in those other posts, and we can do a bunch of other stuff. But that's enough for the moment. And now to use this, we can inside, firstly, let's do it here in our front meta here. We can say, well, layout is going to be layout.njk. I'm just going to copy pasta that into here. Right. And if I reload one of these, it doesn't look like anything, but it's got HTML now, right?
Saved.
Sorry? No, I saved. Did I save? I did save. I didn't save this one. But it does have the HTML content around it. I just haven't styled anything yet, but it has created it. Now, this also applies to the nunchuck stuff, right? So we can create front matter in a nunchucks template, which is really, really useful. So in terms of here, we can also go layout njk, right? And then on, wait, let's just show it here because it's not going to look like anything. And then suddenly our post also has all of the stuff around it that we care about. It doesn't have a title, so it just shows nothing. And we can also reference this stuff, right? So inside here, let's say we wanted a header. So let's go header.njk, which is going to have, let's say, a header element. And then inside it, a header element, it's going to have an h1. And then it's going to have a nav next to the h1. And inside that nav is going to be an anchor tag. Okay. And that's going to be my awesome random site. Random awesome, awesome random. I know there's a specific sequence that you're supposed to put adjectives, but I don't know, I can't remember it. Okay, and then inside here, we're going to go, well, / is going to be home, right? And then we're going to have / posts be posts. Oh, damn it. And then / ships is going to cryptically be ships. Okay. And how we would use this is, let's say in our layout.njk, we want to include this on every single site. So we're going to go step into nunchucks again, and we're going to say, well, I want to include header.njk, right? And then when I reload this, did I save? No, I might not have saved. Damn. Include header.njk, header.njk. That should be right. Layout.njk. No, there it is. There it is. I don't know what I'm doing. Post 1. It's on post 1, but it's not on post 2 for whatever reason. There it is from post 2 now. Must have been a caching issue. Okay. That's going to make a point for me later on. Okay. So let's just put a pin in that one. Jerry, you'll remind me when I get to the caching point. Okay. But now we've just sort of slapshot thrown a whole bunch of data all over the show, right? Because like we don't really want to on every single thing go and specify, well, this is what our layout should look like. So luckily there's the option to, for some of this stuff, create it in a directory. So inside this directory, I can create a posts.json file, okay, which is just a JSON file, and I'm going to add tags to it. And that tags is going to be posts, okay, which is going to mean that the posts are going to automatically be included in each one of these, okay. So let's just show that that works. Right, it still all works because I've now specified everything in that directory has that data item. We can put layout in there for the moment. Sure, let's do that. Layout is going to layout is going to be that. And let's remove it from here. Save that. Let's remove it. Okay, it's removed from there, and it'll still work, right? We still got the exact same layout. There's still posts. Everything's cool. And there's more stuff that we can do about it. So let's say we want all of our posts to, even if I say, well, post 2, I've decided that my naming structure is awful, and I'm going to go 2020-07-01- writing is hard. All right. That's the directory structure or the file structure I want to follow. But now the directories have changed, right? So my URL would have changed, and I'm putting information in that I don't really care about in terms of my user's experience. So I can create something called a permalink for that. And I can just say, well, everything in this directory is going to permalink. Okay? And that permalink is going to be /posts using the title that comes from its own data, and then put a trailing slash so that it creates an index.html. Now this title needs to be safely escaped. So I'm going to just say, well, slug. I think it's slug. Slug or slugify? Slug. All right, so let's just space that properly so we're not sloppy. I'm just going to trash this again so that you can see the change in contents on the left-hand side. Okay, so when I create it, there's now posts, and each post has the title as its directory. Okay, so whatever I call the file in here is completely immaterial, and whatever folder structure I have is completely immaterial. The URL stays consistent, so writing is hard. Okay, so we can use data and a little bit of dynamism to decouple those two items from one another, and then still have static files out of it. Now that's just one part. That's that we've dealt with the front metadata. We've dealt with the directory data. We can also use global data. So there's this _data directory, and inside there I can do something like say, well, layout.js. Okay, and I'm going to module.exports layout.njk. Now what this has done is it said, well, for every layout, for every site, there's going to be or every page in the site, there's going to be a layout variable, a layout data item, and it's going to be set to layout.njk. And that means I can go and remove the layout from here, and everything across the site will by default use the exact same item. Okay, it's not there, it's not there, it's not there. And it was never on hello.md, right? We never changed that. So if I go and refresh, it will still work, right? And I can go to hello, and suddenly hello also has our little header thing, okay? Which is pretty cool. And that lets us do other awesome stuff, right? So like, for example's sake, we can have a ships.js file. And our ships.js file, I'm just going to copy and paste so that I don't make any mistakes. Hope you don't mind. that's going to call out to the Star Wars API and list or fetch all of the ships on the Star Wars API and return it as a JSON data set, and then smash it into Eleventy. Now, what we can do with that is that we can, for example's sake, let me just collapse this directory, and this directory. We can create a ships folder, okay? And inside our ships folder, we're going to create a ships.njk, and we're just going to go straight into front matter. Now we're going to use something called pagination. Now pagination says, well, cool, you give me some data, and that data is going to be ships, right, which you've made globally available. You give me a size, so I want one of these items per page. You give me an alias, and this is the one I always get wrong. It's ship, not ships, because it tries to autocomplete it. And then I'm going to say, well, add all pages to collections. True, I misspelled that. And this is going to say, well, everything that gets generated is going to be added onto a collection. Now, I'm going to make use of the stuff that I showed earlier, which was to say, well, permalink. And I'm going to permalink this to ships /ship.name. I'm going to slugify that thing, and I mustn't forget the trailing slash, so that it creates a directory for it. I'm going to say, well, this is all going to be tagged with ships, so it's going to be added to the ships collection, and the layout will be added by default. Okay. And then in terms of the content that we want for every single page to show the ship name, model, class, manufacturer, length, and number of crew, because we are that weird dystopian fan site. Okay. Now, if you take a look at the output, you will see immediately that it said, well, 1.5 seconds, so 1,400 milliseconds was taken loading ships.js data, and that was 95.7% of your build time. This is really, really important tooling feedback, because as your site grows bigger and it becomes more data oriented, it tells you where your time is being spent in build, okay, which we'll also get to a little bit later. And I've linked a bunch of ships here, but that could just as easily be a headless content management system. It could be the WordPress API that's giving you blog post data, for example's sake, that you're building a bespoke front end on top of. Anyway, so we've got these ships. The ships are hopefully being created in the site directory. And inside the site directory, you can see that there is the Millennium Falcon, which is the only ship that really matters, right? Being created inside our layout. And I'm going to do the index page for this differently to how I did in posts. So inside here, we're just going to create an index.njk. Okay. And that index.njk is going to have a collection of ships. Okay. And in that, I'm just gonna copy pasta from posts, because it is the exact same as posts, excepting one thing, two things, one thing. This is going to be ship. This is going to be ships. We're not going to reverse because we don't have a time. Post or ship.url. And then we want to use the ships data. Okay. Unfortunately, what we will have to do to get the ship name is we'll have to go ship.data.ship.name, because we aliased it to ship, which is a data item, and I've just added ship to. Naming things is hard. Okay, so like if you judge me for my variable names, that's fine. But now hopefully what happens is if I've forgotten or if I've remembered to save everything, we can use our ships URL and get a collection of ships. And then we can go to like a Millennium Falcon or an X-Wing. There we go. 12.5 meters, crew 1, that makes sense. Okay, so let's move on. Now, we've fallen completely into the defaults of Eleventy. And I think you can get pretty far with that if you just want to be told how to do things. But it's not the only way. It's really, really flexible. And we can, just by creating a Eleventy.js file, okay, in the root of the site, we can then specify our config as follows. Okay, I'm just going to copy and paste it. Now, that means that when we start up our browser over here, or our CLI over here, it's going to pass in the defaults into the Eleventy config, and then we can override everything. So if we, for example, sake, had a CSS directory, so let's go, sorry, not file, new folder, CSS. And in fact, let's do that the opposite way around. Sorry, let's comment that out. Let's add a CSS directory. Let's call this main.css, main.css. Okay, and let's just go like body is going to be what? Width 800 pixels, margin auto, or something like that. And then we will see that when we save it, it doesn't copy our CSS through to our site by default. It only recognizes its own templates. So we can then use the Eleventy.js stuff to say, well, I also want you to copy the CSS directory or some wildcard that matches stuff. And then the CSS gets copied across using a reliable URL. And we can now in our layout over here go, well, like, let's go and link to CSS. And that's going to be CSS main.css. And I don't even know, oopsie, that's not the one. I don't even know if it's going to apply. I think my CSS is wrong. But it's there, right? So it's linked through and the style isn't applying onto the body. But that's because of my CSS's problem, not because the thing doesn't exist. Okay, and there's other stuff that we can do here, right? So we can change the defaults, that's fine. We can add filters for like nunchucks and the like. We can create shortcodes, which is relevant for some of the other templating languages, our own tags. We can write custom JavaScript functions that we can then use inside every single element and register it. There's advanced features that we can use for collections and stuff. And then we can use some plugins like generating whole navigation trees, and we don't have to do it ourselves. RSS, syntax highlighting for wherever it finds code blocks, whatever. And you can write your own, which is a good way to reuse code. Okay, so now I'm just going to move back to slides, and we're going to cover some like advanced use cases. And rather than code through it, I just want to firstly talk through some theory and then talk through an example. So overwhelmingly, my adage when it comes to static generation is that if you can build and deploy it fast enough, like it's indistinguishable from being completely live data. If it is minutes from data changing and triggering a rebuild and a redeploy that's completely immutable, then that's probably fast enough for your users. And it's probably faster than your caching will be on a server-side rendered application anyway. So what you can do to trigger that is on significant changes, either in your data or in your application, you can just trigger an immediate redeploy straight to production. And this gives you super, super reliable performance. And that's because the stuff is completely static anyway. And it being completely static means that you get this really nice blast radius, because if your data source breaks, so your API, let's say the Star Wars API goes down, we may not be able to generate a new site with new data, but the site keeps working because it's just static. So if you care about sites being like 100% up, then this is a really, really good example. Whereas if the Star Wars API went down and we were server-side rendered, that would start 500 erroring on every single user visit. And then finally, because everything is super static, we can make the maximum use of caching and then not only use like the browser cache, We can use content delivery networks and every single edge device in between. So every networking switch or routing device that's prepared to cache, we can give it HTTP headers that say, well, cache this thing so that you never have to ask me again. And it gives that user and other users faster experiences. So let's work through an example of what I mean. Let's say, for example's sake, you had a GitHub repository, and in that GitHub repository, on every single commit, there was a build using like GitHub Actions or something that triggered a deployment to wherever your website was hosted, like either GitHub Pages or something else. You could use something called, well, let's say how you would, before I get into what you could use, people link to whatever your blog is. They talk about your blog on social media, on Twitter, whatever the case may be. Those mentions sort of disappear into a black hole, right? But if you use something called web mention, which is an indie web product, which says it understands how to crawl these various sites, it can go and find mentions of a thing that you've registered beforehand, and it will tell you about it, that somebody has spoken about you, or somebody has linked to a particular article. And that can, for example's sake, call a webhook that gets exposed via your build process, in this case, GitHub Actions. And that means that when somebody mentions your website, it's going to rebuild your website and immediately deploy to live and include that mention in the bottom, either as a comment or as a something. And this is not my idea. It's a paradigm that exists. And there's a really, really good article by a fellow GDE that has a very detailed walkthrough of how you can use web mentions and Eleventy in conjunction. Now, the stuff is not a nirvana and it's not without its own problems. And I think the first problem is we've just discussed static markup, right? And at some point in time, you're going to want some sort of JavaScript and you're going to want to share JavaScript across your site. And that means that you need to set up a very smart Webpack config, for example's sake, that's going to bundle appropriately across all of your various endpoints or entry points, sorry. Because every single HTML file is a new entry point to your site. You're going to need to figure out how to create suitable common bundles. And the build to production or build to deploy approach, really, it works really well with data. So like when your data changes, if you can trigger a reindex and rebuild your site, it doesn't work really well with combinatorial effects. So when every one data item, let's say a Star Wars ship, had 10 languages associated to that data item that it could be translated into, that means that as your data set increases, your build times have this exponentially large increase time, which is not great. And then cycling back to the caching problem that we had earlier with the page reloading, you have to deal with caching appropriately because you are responsible for sending those headers and making sure that your site is appropriately cached. Otherwise, your users are going to see stale data. And there's a reason why there's a joke about caching being the hardest problem in computer science. Sorry, second hardest. Hardest being naming things. And with that, I will happily take any questions you have on either this or privacy and why privacy is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. We'll dive straight into the questions. Well done. That was an incredible talk. It reminded me of when I attended GDG Southern Africa in Botswana last year. And I mentioned that I work with Mike Geyser. And this one developer from Mozambique said, oh my goodness, that man's live coding skills are next level. Today, you just reminded me on that. So thank you very much for that awesome talk. So the first question, and some of these questions, I think from the time that they were asked, you may have touched on the answers later on, but I'll ask them nonetheless. And the first question is that, so is the data fetched from the API when you build, or is it fetched every time a user visits your site?
So the data is fetched from the API in terms of the example that I had. Every single time the site changes and rebuilds, it'll fetch that data and regenerate stuff using the data. Okay, so whenever it builds, it will fetch the data. Now, the magic part is using a webhook or something else to, on data change or on a schedule, rebuild the site and then fetch fresh data. So if you've got a content site, for example's sake, why don't, if it takes you a couple seconds to regenerate the current day's news, right? So if the build takes you seconds, then why don't you every 15 minutes go and fetch the data and then rebuild the site? That's sort of what I was getting at. And in the web mentions example that I had, that was, it's web mentions itself that can call a webhook. So it tells you when something's changed, and then you just trigger a build. But that could be a pub sub message for people that live in a distributed systems world. It could be a trigger on a database, right? That somebody on a backend system has changed a record, and the trigger fires and says, cool, well, now go and call a thing and do a thing.
Absolutely great answer. I think you've changed my understanding of what static sites are. And the next question speaks a bit to that. So the next question reads, what happens with Eleventy when you want to save data? Let's say, take an e-commerce store as an example. How would I save my product orders?
Awesome. Two separate concerns, right? How you present your product and how you then consume the request for orders are different. So you would still need to put an API behind this that dealt with that, or you would need to have something that you would form posts to and then redirect away from. So it's not a great fit for just out of the box being a full end-to-end experience, the same way that server-side rendered applications are pretending to be. But that's why you have the ability to write JavaScript on top of it and write very simple UIs that are super performant that then write back to a very controlled API. And you just decrease the blast impact of your API.
Awesome. Absolutely clear. And I think a similar question to that asks, when do you know when it's time to use Eleventy over something like React or Angular?
Cool. So when you have distinctly identifiable entry points to your application, so like a product page, okay? With Angular or React, you've got a single entry point, right? So you will load up the whole monolithic application and then go and find whatever data it is that the user's talking about, and then take that data and take the small part of JavaScript that you care about for this particular page and spin that all up and then say, hey, here you go. That's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because you want the user to get a good experience where they know where they're going to and they know what content they want to see. So Eleventy is when you know that you've got lots of different paths into your application, and it's far more about the content than it is about the clicky experience. So I would use that as a guiding principle. And the thing is that Angular and React are not a replacement for any kind of server-side stuff, right? They don't exist by themselves. Anybody who's had to deploy an Angular application to some production site and actually have it work when the user refreshes knows that you need other stuff as well. And this just gives you really bare bone skeleton to hang that off of.
Awesome, thank you. So having had a very tiny bit of exposure to a bit of Eleventy, I think your talk really expanded on the possibilities of Eleventy. And the next question asks, what are the benefits of making your own Eleventy blog over using something else that's already been made?
That's a great question, and I forgot to mention it because I was hurrying. You totally shouldn't. You should use one of the incredible Eleventy blog starters that comes with all of the things set up out of the box that you can just clone that and start plugging into wherever you care about, right? They're by and large really high quality. You can pick which one you want, and they've got various levels of plumbing. Just don't pick one that's got all of the bells and whistles because you don't need it.
Awesome. So I think that ties into what Fadzayi's talk mentioned, in that use what, or collect and take only what you need, because otherwise you might end up getting yourself into trouble. And then this one, I think, so This question reads, does the name Eleventy have something to do with Lord of the Rings?
I know that was Jerry that asked that. I'm certain it was Jerry that asked that. I don't think so, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that it's not cool, right? Something can be cool and not be directly related to Lord of the Rings. I say wearing a wizard t-shirt.
With the Council of Wizards, by the way. Mike, that was the last question for tonight. Thank you so much for your amazing talk. Thank you very much for Fadzayi. She's probably asleep right now because she's always ahead of us. But thank you much to everyone for attending this month's Jozi.js. We will see you next month. Keep an eye out on meetup.com. That's where we will keep you updated on the upcoming Jozi.js meetups. Big apologies for not having one last month, but you will be very, very happy to know that we've actually got speakers for almost the rest of the year. I think we still need 1 or 2 speakers. So please, please, please submit a talk and let's get you speaking into this community that we all love so much. With that said, if there's nothing else from the rest of the Council of Wizards, I think we'll say good night on that note. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month. Cheers. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.